Hello, buddy. Welcome back to Tin Man Square Channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor, and today I'm reacting to my third and final Shiny Gold Tails video for you guys, and this was titled 4 True Scary Camping Horror Stories. So without further ado, I'm going to turn these lights off, move the camera up here for you guys, and let's get this reaction on the road in the bag, shall we? Okay, here we go.
Photography has always been my passion. I'd always wanted to do it full time, and a few years ago, I made the leap and quit my 9-to-5 job. It was scary at first. I didn't know if I could make enough money. There were some months early on where I actually didn't make enough, but eventually things picked up, and I have never looked back.
Hey, that's how life works. You got a passion for something that you could think you can make it to a career, just take the risk and jumping right into it. You may have some slips and misses, but once you start gaining enough traction, then you know, oh, this can actually really work, and you can make some decent money off of it. So if anybody's got a passion for something that they want to turn into a career, go for it. I mean, look at me. I'm trying to make my YouTube channel career, so I'm going to keep pushing forward, and you guys should too on whatever career path you have set in mind for yourself. But anyway, let's get back into this story, shall we?
One of my most profitable endeavors has been nature photography. Landscapes, wildlife, really anything interesting that I can find. A few times per year, I go on a week-long trek in the wilderness and just take as many pictures as I can, usually thousands. Out of them, I'm usually able to get a few hundred shots that are just fantastic. I make money by licensing them to businesses, websites, or for film and television. On one of these trips, something happened that I will never forget. I had planned a solo trek in the forests of Washington State. There's a spot that I heard of which is supposed to have some of the most incredible landscapes in the world. Access to this spot was supposed to be incredibly difficult. It would be a 3-day hike in and out through some pretty rugged land. There was no vehicle access at all. That was okay though, because I didn't mind a challenge. If it was easy, then everyone would do it and my work would not be as special.
That is true. There's always going to be challenges in life, so you got to always find a way to hurdle through them. But hey, that is cool that you're able to find companies that you can like license your pictures and they pay you top dollar for them. Especially for like landscape and animal pictures. I know they bring in top-notch money because I don't know if anybody would want a framed picture of like city buildings or skyscrapers. But also a 3-day camping trip through this rugged terrain sounds amazing because you might encounter a rare species of a certain type of animal and you could take photos of that. But let's just see what happens next, shall we?
I was stunned by the beauty of the scenery as I hiked in. It seemed that around every corner there was a postcard-worthy shot. Rolling hills, waterfalls, and I even saw a full-grown moose, the first I'd ever seen. I stopped to set up camp as the sun started to dip below the horizon. My first memory card was already filled with some great pictures. The next 2 days were similar. Things were going great. There was not a sound to be heard other than the wind rustling in the trees and the occasional bird's song. I was feeling very alone. Not many people trek this far in, and there was something eerie about it. I realized that I was taking a risk, and it would have made sense to go with a partner, but I didn't know anybody who was willing to take a week off work to walk 6 days straight. It was nearing dusk. I had already set up my camp for the night, and I was doing some exploring around my site, hoping to get a few more good shots before calling it a night. That was when I heard something. It sounded like footsteps. At first, I was sure it was a deer, but as I followed the noise, I changed my mind. Deer are very delicate and deliberate with every step. They place their hooves straight down in order to minimize noise and avoid attention from predators. This sound was more of a constant trudge, like a person was walking, dragging their toes with every step. The noise became louder as I continued to follow, until I saw something through the thick bush that shocked and terrified me. There was a woman walking slowly through the forest. She was older, probably in her 60s. She wore a pristine white gown and high heel shoes. Her hair was done up as if she were going to the Oscars. Her makeup was also done for the occasion. I was further confused because she didn't have any backpack or equipment, just a white purse that matched her dress, which was dragging behind her as she walked. It would seem sensible that I should try to help her, but for some reason, that didn't seem right.
No, I would try to stay away from that person because that just don't seem normal. A woman wearing a nice white gown, high heels, and wearing fancy makeup, like she's going to the ball or the Oscars, like he pointed out, is not the appropriate attire for camping in the woods. So this guy might be encountering a deranged woman, possibly. So if his camera doesn't make a huge flash noise, he should take a picture of that person and try to hightail it out of there before that woman notices him. This is already sounding scary to even hear.
Something about her made me think that she was exactly where she wanted to be, like she belonged in the forest. I know that doesn't make any sense, but that's the feeling that I had at the time. There was a sense of tranquility radiating from this woman. I stood and stared for several minutes before she disappeared into the distance. Several more minutes, and the sound of her footsteps faded into nothingness. When the sun was almost gone, I used the last few minutes of light to walk back to my campsite. As you may have guessed, I stayed awake by the fire all night. I sat there for hours, poking and prodding the smoldering logs, and thought about what I had seen. Part of me was expecting to see the woman again, but that didn't happen. I never saw or heard from her again. When morning came, I began the walk out. My mind was racing as I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation for what I'd seen. There was no way to get to that spot without doing the 3-day hike that I had done. To do it in high heels without food and water would be near impossible. I may never be able to explain what I saw or why I didn't approach her. All I can say is that I really wish I'd taken a picture.
You should have. I just mentioned it because nobody wouldn't believe you if you don't have photo evidence of whoever's walking in the woods. But yeah, that is so not normal for anybody to be walking in the woods wearing a nice dress and high heels because they'll probably trip and fall over. But it makes you wonder if it's a ghost of a person that probably went to prom and their date killed them and threw them in the woods. I mean, I don't know. That's the only thing I could come up with. That's one scary thing to even see out in the middle of the woods while you're camping. But I'll be scared to even approach somebody like that because you never know, they might start screaming like a maniac. But thank God, when the sun rose up, he did not hesitate. He packed up and got out of there. Because I know if he stayed there longer, that woman probably would have wandered into his camp and scared the crap out of him. But still, I hope he did get some good shots of the forest and animals in that area while he was there.
This happened a few years ago when I was 22 years old. I live in a beautiful part of the country. I prefer not to say exactly where, but you should know that there are a lot of forested areas. When I was growing up, I would often go camping in the vast expanses of rugged wilderness that surrounded my home. I was in the Boy Scouts from a young age, so I think it's fair to say that I'm experienced when it comes to the outdoors. It had been a few years since I graduated from high school, but I was still close with several of my friends from those days. Jim and Andrew were my best friends at the time. They still are, actually. Jim was in the Boy Scouts with me, and he shared my love for the outdoors. Andrew, on the other hand, is more of a city guy. He's lots of fun, though, so we try to drag him out whenever we can. The three of us decided to go on a camping trip for a weekend in the late summer, probably the first or second week of September, at least a few weeks before the leaves started to fall from the trees. It was still warm enough that we didn't need to bring much. We just used my old tent and a few blankets. On Saturday morning, we set off in Jim's truck, with no specific idea of where we were going to set up. Like I said, I'd been camping in this area for most of my life, so I was fairly comfortable with winging it. It's more fun that way anyway.
I'm a huge fan of the countryside as well, but if I went camping, I'm not going by myself because I know I have some friends that probably were more experienced in the hunting and fishing, so they would know the outdoors better than I would. I had to rely on them to even help me survive through a long camping excursion. But so far, it sounds like everything's going according to plan for them. They're getting their old baggy tent of his, and he's got some friends to go along with him. So let's just see what happens to make this whole trip go downhill pretty fast.
At around 11 a.m., we found a great campsite. It was close enough to the road that we were able to drive the truck all the way in. It was a rough ride to get in, though. A lot of bumps from rocks and tree roots. Jim's truck had four-wheel drive, though, so it wasn't that big of a deal. That was good, because Andrew doesn't like to sleep on the ground. He would take the back seat of the truck, while Jim and I would sleep in the tent. We spent a few hours setting up camp. I set up the tent and did some other stuff. Andrew gathered firewood, and Jim built a pretty impressive table out of logs and a piece of old plywood that we found lying around. His Boy Scout credentials were up there with the best of them. After all that was done, we decided to go for a hike and explore the area. It was about 2 or 3 p.m. when we started walking. Not a whole lot happened on our hike. We checked out the area and found a hidden lake. The shore was pretty marshy, though, so we didn't go in. One thing did catch our attention, though. We saw what looked like fresh footprints that didn't belong to any of us. The location was quite remote, so we were not expecting to see anyone else. It was public land, though, so there was no guarantee that there wouldn't be others out there. When we got back to our campsite, however, I saw something that made my jaw drop. There was a large knife stuck into the middle of Jim's table. It was a hunting knife with a wood handle and a piece of yellow tape wrapped around it. "Hey Jim, is that your knife?" I said, pointing at it. When I looked at him, his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He was as terrified as I'd ever seen him. Someone was there while we were away. Not only that, but whoever it was seemed to have bad intentions. Our next move was pretty obvious. We got into the truck, not even bothering to take down camp. Jim started the engine, but as soon as we started moving, another problem arose. The tires were flat. I got out to check, and it was clear that they had been intentionally slashed, probably with the knife that was jammed into our table. We left the truck and all of our gear and started running. It had been about a 25-minute drive from the main road, so we estimated roughly double that on foot. As we sprinted through the forest, time seemed to stand still. I would look back every now and then, but never saw anyone chasing us. We never slowed down. It's amazing what adrenaline can do, and we eventually made it to the main road. As luck would have it, there was a truck coming. Andrew flagged it down and told the driver our story. He was happy to help, and we jumped into the back. A tremendous feeling of relief engulfed my body as the truck started to move. Just then, I looked to the side of the road, and I could see a dark figure standing on the bush line. I couldn't see his face because he was wearing a large hooded sweatshirt, but he was holding a knife. The knife that I saw at our campsite.
Thank God they did the right thing and just got their necessities and leave the other camping gear behind after seeing that knife stabbed in the table, because that would be a sign that, yep, there's somebody else here in the woods with us, and they're probably there to scare them off, or he might come back to rob them of their possessions, or worse, murder them. You just don't know. But seeing him in the wood line after you're leaving in the big truck would be scary for sure. I mean, that would send cold shivers down my spine. So they did the right thing and just packed what they could and got out. I know by the time they got back to grab their tent, he probably would have slashed that up too with the knife. I know now that they are going to remember that if they see footprints and then that's not theirs, they're going to be extra cautious because they don't want to have another experience like this one ever again.
When I was younger, probably 12 or 13, my best friend's name was Ethan. He would go to camp every summer for 2 weeks. It was always the most boring part of the summer for me because Ethan and I would spend most of our time together during the months that we were off from school. That's why I begged my parents to let me go to camp with him one summer. Money was tight in my family, so it was a tough sell, but my parents eventually decided that it would be a good experience for me, so they agreed. We set off early on a Saturday morning. Ethan's parents agreed to take me since they were going to drop Ethan off anyway. I was thrilled to be joining my friend at camp for once. He had told me many stories over the last few years, and I was finally going to get to experience what, up until then, I had only heard about. To be honest, though, I was a little nervous. I had never really been out of the city for more than a night or two, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it. When we arrived, there were several log cabins scattered around a clearing in the forest, and one large cabin that seemed to be the mess hall and office for the head counselor.
You know, that would be nice to experience camping in the woods and then stay in like a cabin, but then have to have a mess hall where you can actually go get food that's prepared for you, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's also another big bonus. But you always got to be careful because if you go to a place like this, you never know who's also going to be staying there in another cabin, and they might have some bad intentions. Let's just put it that way. I don't know what they are, so let's just continue on with this guy's story and see what happens next.
It was a very picturesque scene, with giant trees, bubbling brooks, and fresh air. We were really in the middle of nowhere, it seemed. When we arrived at the camp, we were greeted by a few of the counselors. They were friendly enough, and they were only a few years older than Ethan and I. We were about 12, and they were about 17 or 18. It does seem like an accident waiting to happen, just having a bunch of kids out there in the wilderness. But people have been doing it for generations, so maybe a little independence isn't the worst thing. We spent the next few days getting oriented and doing some basic stuff. Playing games, swimming and canoeing in a nearby lake. Just the usual summer camp stuff. I was catching on quickly, and therefore my previous concerns had disappeared. After the first week in the camp, we set out on a hiking trip that would last for 2 whole nights. We would sleep under the stars and really have a chance to put our skills to the test. As we made our way through the forest, the counselors told us stories of their time at the camp. They also told us of an old legend that was passed on through the years. Apparently, there used to be a prison not far from there, and a long time ago, one of the prisoners escaped, one of the counselors told me. He was a seriously deranged psychopath. I won't get into the details of what they say he did. You will have to take my word for it that it is disturbing. On a previous escape attempt, this criminal lost one of his hands trying to scale a barbed wire fence, so he had a wooden hand on one side. After he escaped, he hid out in these forests trying to live off the land. He was never found, and nobody heard from him again. But some people have reported sightings as recently as the last few years. However, it's incredibly unlikely because by then, this guy would have been in his 90s, living off of grubs and worms in the forest by himself, with one hand. I was a skeptical person, so my initial thought was that it was just a made-up story that the counselors would tell to scare the campers.
I'll be thinking that as well, but there may be some truth to that. If he escaped and he's probably in his 90s by now, he could probably still be functioning out in the woods just trying to keep himself alive by eating roots and other vegetation. Because I know that guy really wanted to escape and have a chance of freedom. But if there's people reporting him, you might want to take it serious because he might end up wandering into your camp.
Ethan, however, seemed to believe it, although we both agreed that there was no way this guy was still out there. We eventually stopped for the night and set up camp. It was late by then, so everyone went straight to sleep. Well, everyone except Ethan and I. As soon as I laid down my head, I heard Ethan whisper in my ear, "Hey man, get up. I want to check something out." I slipped out of my sleeping bag and we snuck out of the campsite. "Dude, what's going on?" I grumbled. "I saw something a while back. There was some kind of cabin. I saw it through the trees," he explained. Our flashlights were hardly useful in the thick bush. They only lit up a few feet ahead of us as we trudged through the tree branches and over fallen logs. My mind was fixated on the story that our counselor had told us about the escaped prisoner who lived in these forests. It was a creepy feeling to imagine him out there all alone. The bush seemed endless until we reached a clearing. The glow of our flashlights burst when they reached the opening. A blanket of light fell upon an old shack which stood in front of us. Ethan and I looked at each other and exchanged excited looks. We weren't scared, just curious. The shack was clearly uninhabited, so we weren't worried about trespassing. The windows were all broken. The front door was hanging from a single hinge, and there was a large hole in the sparsely shingled roof. When Ethan and I walked through the front door, our jaws dropped. It was an absolute mess, that much was expected, but what really struck us was the walls. They were all carved up with some kind of symbols or creepy drawings. I don't even know what they were, but they were incredibly unsettling, like some kind of ritual had taken place there. Although it was creepy, we didn't sense any danger, and our curiosity was still begging us to keep investigating. Ethan went to check out the other room, while I stayed to examine the etchings on the far wall. I was fixated on the mediocre artwork when I heard Ethan whisper, "Dude, get in here." I walked over to him, and his face was white as a ghost. He was pointing at something on the floor. When I finally got close enough to see it, my stomach sank. There was a wooden hand just laying in the middle of the room. With that, Ethan and I had seen enough. We bolted out of there and quickly made our way back to the safety of our campsite. We crawled into our sleeping bags, where we laid wide awake until the sun greeted us in the morning. We never told anyone what we saw that night. Part of me thinks it was an elaborate prank by the counselors. Like they set up the shack to look all scary, then told us the story and led us past it, hoping that a few of the more curious campers would find it and get scared. However, the more I think about it, I don't think that's what happened. It's too far-fetched, too elaborate. Besides, they never got to witness our reaction, so where's the fun? I believe that we stumbled upon the hideout of an escaped murderer that night, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life.
Yeah, that would haunt me for the rest of my life, too, if I stumbled in the woods and found a cabin with a wooden hand that belonged to a potential serial killer. But thank God they did not see his body if they did not find him in time. Because I know that would be a scary thing to see, especially if it was starting to stink. But after they got done seeing that, they should have went and told their camp counselors what they saw. Maybe they would have believed them, or they'd probably be like, "Oh, you're taking this story way too seriously." But if you take them and show them, then, they'll believe you.
My first experience with the supernatural was one of the most terrible experiences of my life. It happened when I was young and wanted to go out into the world and explore. While I was out of my home country of Canada, I witnessed a horror I hope to soon forget. I had gone on a trip with some of my buddies to Montana, just below my home province of Alberta. We were originally going to stay in Yellowstone National Park, but decided to head to Glacier National Park first before camping out at Yellowstone for a few days. We finally reached Glacier Park after about a 6-hour drive and had just enough time to do a little hiking before going to our hotel in the nearby town to rest and move on towards Yellowstone. We got to the park at around 4:30 p.m. and decided it was a great idea to hike after dark, so we hiked up a trail looking at the glorious views of rivers and waterfalls. The light began to fade rather quickly while we were about 2/3 of the way up. We had hiked in about 10 kilometers, so it would take us about 2 hours to walk back down from that point. This is when it all goes downhill. Myself and my friends were all outdoorsmen and loved to go hiking and travel around the Rocky Mountains, but we were still inexperienced when it came to night hiking. Since the trail wasn't well traveled at this point of the hike, it was hard to follow in the dark, although every now and then we would see a sign that notified us that we were on the right track. At some point, maybe a third of the way down the mountain, we ended up going off the trail and following a little rabbit trail, thinking we were still on the correct path. We began to figure out that we were definitely not going the right way, because my friend checked his compass, showing we were headed deeper and deeper into the forest. Then began the mass panic. My friends and I immediately turned around, began walking the way we came, but the trail we were following didn't look the same. We were becoming more and more lost. That's when we all noticed how quiet it had become. No insects, no birds, nothing. It was dead silence. I knew that was a bad sign, because when it gets quiet like that, it means that there's a large predator around, and that it's hunting. We had literally become prey to something unknown in the woods. We all got a spike of adrenaline when I let the guys know what was up. That's when I heard a noise that brought terror. A guttural howl from up the mountain, and it was followed by many more. My heart went into my throat, and the terror I felt made me shake. Most of my friends did the same, but 2 others had already dipped and began running in the direction opposite the howls. We all followed soon after, running ourselves ragged until we looked behind us and saw the eye shine of something that was much larger than we had anticipated. The eyes were at least 6 feet off the ground and moving towards us fast. That's when we split up running in random directions, hoping to lose these beasts. It was never going to happen. I could hear the breath of one of them about 20 feet behind me and gaining. All of a sudden, my friend appeared from the right, and we ended up running together until I cut off from him, hoping to escape. I know I left him to die that night, but it was a last-ditch effort that worked out to my advantage. I heard his screams from my left and ran as fast as I could away from them, with tears rolling down my face. I heard his screams for help until it eventually stopped. I continued running down the mountain until I saw a familiar sight ahead of me. It was one of the signs from the main trail. I stopped to check where I was, then started running again, hoping to get away from the creatures on the mountain. Another kilometer down the trail, and I began to hear howls getting closer and closer by the moment that caused me to run even harder. Looking ahead, I saw a sign for the parking lot and zoomed past it in my panic. I looked for the keys in my pocket and scrambled towards the only vehicle still left, which was my car. I used my fob to unlock it from a distance and ran as hard as I could towards it. I slammed into the side of my door and opened it, hopping in and starting the car. I looked out my window towards the trail entrance and saw 2 pairs of eyes staring at me, just out of range of the lamp posts. They stared at me before disappearing back into the brush, and I drove away, never looking back. I arrived at the ranger station by the park entrance and ran inside, looking disheveled and terrified. I began telling the ranger at the desk what had happened. He looked at me with a sad face, as if he knew something like this would happen. He called the search and rescue team. They conducted a thorough search the next morning. No bodies were found, and they were never heard from again.
Well, after hearing this guy's testimony, I would narrow it down to it being a dog man, because he said he heard howls and he saw eyes that were like 6 feet off the ground. And no normal wolf or dog stand up that high. But then I figured when the Rangers went to go find the bodies, they would have been eaten up and buried, probably. You just don't know. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on post notifications for more Shiny Gold Tails reactions like this. This has been another successful installment of the Tin Man's Corner channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor. I said that's a wrap, and have a nice day.